Welcome, dear listeners, to the presentation on assessment in education for sustainable development. So we already talked about what does ESD mean, what's the role also of education in society, in sustainable development. We talked about teaching and learning processes for sustainable development, and I like now to focus on assessment in education for sustainable development, because I think that's also an important issue we should think about when we teach ESD. So I will first give you a definition of assessment in ESD. What does assessment then, especially in education for sustainable development, mean? And what is also assessment for learning versus assessment of learning? So you can start with thinking about how do you assess your students when you are a teacher or university professor? What does assessment mean for you? What does it mean for your teaching process? And also, which kind of assessment, for instance, would you recommend to teachers of primary education? We will come to this later maybe, or I hope that we will answer these questions in the course of the presentation. So I first like to give you a definition. Assessment is the systematic collection, review and use of information about educational programs undertaken for the purpose of improving student learning and development. So this assessment very clearly states that its assessment is also for improving learning and for the whole learning process, the development. Assessment is an ongoing process aimed at understanding and improving student learning, as just also said before. It involves making our expectations explicit and public, setting appropriate criteria and standards for learning quality, systematically gathering, analyzing and interpreting evidence to determine how well performance matches those expectations and standards, and using the resulting information to document, explain and also improve performance. So we should see it as a status quo, but also how can we learn from this assessment and from the assessment results, and how can we then better improve the whole teaching and the learning process. What's the purpose of assessment in ESD? So to provide students with feedback on their learning, to help them figure out how they can improve their performance, their learning process, to provide feedback also for the teacher on the student's progress and also on how effective his or her teaching style, teaching methods are, to help also to motivate the students and to help the students to progress on to the next stage of learning. We see assessment as a process of learning, and it is how we check that learning is taking or has taken place, so that we can decide what needs to happen next. So what are the next steps, how we can improve. It looks at the same time back and forward, and of course it can play a key role in raising achievement and also improving student outcomes when undertaken effectively and also of course appropriately according to our teaching methods, and can be used at all levels of the system. So according to the Ministry of Education of New Zealand, assessment is a process of inquiry, decision making, adaptation and transformation. And they have also developed a model which I'd like to show you on the next slide. So here you can see that assessment is really seen as a process. It starts with inquiry. So here it's important that you collect good quality information from a range of sources. You receive and consider feedback from others. You analyze and interpret, so also kind of self-assessment and reflection. You identify the strengths and weaknesses of the teaching. you decide what progress has been made, and you consider whether progress really matches also the progress that you expected as a teacher. Based on this, you can decide what needs to be done next. You can identify the best ways to adjust current strategies so that you're also able to adapt your teaching strategies, methodology, when you discover that the learning process or progress is not that good as you expected, for instance. And very important is also that you can provide feedback to others to support their inquiry as well. Then it's the adaptation, so you respond to what has been learned. You can plan, you can do changes, new initiatives, new activities. You can also change your goals and targets if that's important. You can determine success indicators also for future inquiry. And the last part is also the transformation of the learning process, so that you put the required changes into practice to really achieve the improvement, to improve your practice, to promote further progress and enhance learning. So here you can see that also you as a teacher are part of this learning process, and you can also learn with your students and learn or try to identify how can you improve as a teacher to serve the needs of the students. So what is now assessment in education for sustainable development? Assessment procedures impact immensely on teaching and learning. And very often, maybe you have also experienced this as a teacher or maybe also as a student when you look back, that assessment can have a very negative backwash effect also on the process of teaching and learning. For many students, assessment is associated with stress and competition, but this shouldn't be the case. So it should be a form how they can also say where do they stand now and how can they improve and also go on. So it's very important that you consider assessment also when planning new curriculum or lessons, and to plan, of course, appropriate methods of assessment that will support and complement the desired approaches for teaching and learning. So when choosing your assessment methods, you should also take into account, if possible, the 5 pillars of learning: learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together, learning to be, and learning to transform oneself and society. So that you really consider that you don't only ask for knowledge, but also for the skills, for the values and perspectives and the learning process students undertook. What do we now mean with assessment for learning instead of assessment of learning? So the methods of assessment used, they should really attempt to promote higher order thinking, and this is meant with assessment for learning. So for instance, when students compare, contrast, portray a particular set of skills, when analyzing, applying, questioning, debating, solving problems, drawing conclusions, predicting outcomes, evaluating and appraising, for instance, these would be tasks or possibilities how you can focus on assessment for learning, and it really should promote student learning rather than only assessing whether students know the information you have taught before or know specific data. So to see it more in a broader picture. It's a learner-oriented approach that actively involves the learner in the process of assessment and improvement. And for instance, examples that can also easily be applied in the classroom are questioning, are feedback that you really give active feedback to the students. Self and peer assessment can be very good good assessment methods for assessment for learning, that you improve the learning process so that students also learn to self-assess their competences, their knowledge, but also peer assess so that they talk with their partners, with other students about what have they learned, where are the challenges, how can they improve. So with assessment, the students, they should become motivated and really experience assessment also as a tool for improvement. It's also important that there is a coherence between the stated learning outcomes and the methods of assessment used. This table here shows the difference between assessment of learning and assessment for learning. And for instance, assessment of learning, it happens after the learning has taken place. So you provide information, students have to learn it, and then you ask this information. And on the other hand, assessment for learning, it's an integrative part of the whole learning process. Assessment for learning now, it's not only information that is gathered by the teachers and the students are just passive learners, but it's the information is better shared with the learners, and the students are also active in their own learning. They contribute better to their own learning process. So it's from information that is only transformed into marks or grades into information that also gives you information on the quality of the learning, so providing feedback. It's not only the comparison with the performance of others, so it's not so focusing on this competitive aspect, but it's more comparison with the aims and objectives that is important. So it's based on your personal improvement, and that also when you as a student have difficulties with learning, with getting all those information, but the teacher sees that you really try and that you can really improve your learning process, although maybe you are not, you don't know as much as your colleagues, but you can really show that you improve. This also counts, and this is also important. So assessment of learning, it looks back on past learning, and assessment for learning also looks forward to the next stage of learning. The main priority is on promoting students' learning instead of also only accountability, ranking or certifying. And assessment of learning, it of course can have a negative impact on the students, especially students with low attainment who begin to believe they cannot really learn. So assessment for learning really tries that the students, that it shows that they really can learn, and it better helps them to make improvements. And so it really should result in enhanced learning, in improving the learning process. This figure also shows what we've just said. So how can you from passive learning, from passive teaching, come to a more active and transformative teaching? And what's also the role of the teacher, and what's the role of the student? So it again, for instance, says that not teaching is the main focus, but learning, and that you should as a teacher encourage your students also that they raise questions, that they ask when something is unclear, that they can be also creative and better work in teams, that you not only set clear rules, but that you provide more guidelines, and that you also try to take this holistic approach of sustainability. And also students, of course, from passive learners, they have to try to be more active learners, and they should also be more interested, ask questions, but also of course answer your questions. They should learn from each other, also learn from their mistakes, so they shouldn't shouldn't fear mistakes, but should take them as a potential, as a chance to improve their learning and also better collaborate with each other. Don't see this competition, but more the collaboration, and that they then also experience that they can improve and better learn when they learn with each other. Of course, assessment is a challenge, and I've listed here some questions that might help you when choosing or when planning your teaching, your classes, and when you like to choose the type of assessment, that you think about what is it really you want your students to learn, what do they already know, so is it also a pre-test, or do you measure also prior knowledge, which assessments methods really match also your teaching styles, which methods really test what the students have learned. Is it about memorization or really the performance? How many assessments would be sufficient? So do you only have one exam, for instance, at the end of the lesson or the semester, or will you have more? And will your students get feedback or only the grades? So just some questions that should make it easier for you to plan your assessment when you think about it, and the assessment is more appropriate also what your teaching objectives also were. So we can differentiate between formative and summative assessment. In formative assessments, the main aim is to improve instructional methods and students' feedback throughout the teaching and learning process. It is concerned with identifying achievement and progress and strengths and weaknesses in order to decide what action is needed to improve learning on a day-by-day basis. And formative assessment, for instance, these are ongoing assessment, reviews, also observations in classrooms. On the other hand, summative assessment, here the aim is to make a judgment of student competency after an instructional phase is completed. The summative use of assessment is concerned with summing up achievement at a specific point of time. It typically is used to evaluate the effectiveness of instructional programs and services at the end of an academic year. And for instance, final exams would be summative assessment. So on the next two slides, you can see a table, and on the first one, forms of tasks are collected addressing knowledge, skills, and competences, the social competence, and also your values, perspectives that are important for sustainable development. And for instance, you can see that written exams and tests, they focus on knowledge, on the skills, but don't take into account your social competences or your perspective. And there are other methods like presentations, group exams, learning portfolios, games, peer teaching that really better integrate different aspects of learning. And this table now shows forms of assessment you can choose. For instance, feedback or doing rubrics. They're really a good example how you can really try to address the learning process of the students, their knowledge, but also the skills they have learned, if their social competence has improved, if they also have to think about their values and perspectives. The same with self-assessment and peer assessment. So just to give you some examples, that there are assessment methods that focus on the bigger picture, and not only assessing the knowledge. So thank you very much for your attention and also interest in this topic, and I hope that you have now a better understanding or also better perspective what assessment means for education for sustainable development, and also how we can use assessment to improve the learning process of the students. Thank you.